There comes a time in every society where things get so bad beyond all hope that a brave, bold, brazen leader is needed desperately. Eventually, one brave man steps up for the cause. We see this today with President Donald Trump, the unthinkable adversity that he's faced in trying to put America back on the right course and take it out of the grip of the dark forces that has held it captive for so many decades. A similar situation presented itself in the early 1800s, and the bold leader who stepped up during that time period is who we were talking about in Chapter 4 of the Rothschild dynasty. Andrew Jackson takes on the Rothschilds. In the ashes of the War of 1812, America teetered on the brink of despair. Freed from the grip of the first central bank in 1811, it seemed as though liberty might truly thrive, but the powerful Rothschild family forced America into another conflict, plunging the young nation into a crippling debt. The cost of this was the reluctant acceptance of a new central bank in 1816, shackling the country to an inflationary spiral once again that seemed completely hopeless. Yet, in the darkest of times, heroes emerge. Horrified by the power that bankers held and enraged by the corruption infecting the nation's leaders, Jackson refused to stand idly by. He rose against the tide, determined to purge America of this financial menace. He formed his own political party dedicated to freeing the people from economic tyranny, and embarked on his journey to the presidency with a fierce purpose and unwavering resolve. So Andrew Jackson runs for president in 1828. He wins, and he quickly begins building congressional support, advocating his case. And he comes in like an absolute bull in a china shop. You thought Trump was bold? So this is what Andrew Jackson comes in and says as his first State of the Union address. Walks in there, swagging out. Gentlemen, I've been a close observer of the Bank of the United States, and I'm convinced that you have used funds of the bank to speculate. When you won, you divided the profits amongst you. When you lost, you charged it to the bank. You tell me that if I take the deposits from the bank and annul its charter, I shall ruin 10,000 families. That may be true, gentlemen, but that is your sin. Should I let you go on, you will ruin 50,000 families, and that would be my sin. You are a den of vipers and thieves. I've determined to rout you out, and by the eternal ether of God, I will rout you out. And he bangs his fist on the table. Boom, bah. So comes in with that bold statement. And that's a dangerous thing to say at the time, because a lot of people in Congress and in the media, they're rolling in the dough, because as long as they stay on the side of the money printing machine, the good times keep on rolling. So the main villain in this story is a guy named Nicholas Biddle. He's the head of the Bank of the United States at this time, and he wielded immense power over the nation's credit. He was basically like the Jerome Powell of that time, but probably with more power, because, you could be a little more corrupt back then. Important note, so Nicholas Biddle, he is confirmed to have been an agent for the Rothschilds by Eustace Mullins in his book, The Federal Reserve Conspiracy. So the name Nicholas Biddle is synonymous with Rothschild for this part of the story. But don't worry, the Rothschilds will surface later in a very overt way. So Biddle, super smart guy, graduated college when he was 16 or something like that. So he strategically waits until 1832, Jackson's re-election year, to put in the bid for an extension of the bank's charter, where it'd be maximum controversial for Jackson to oppose it. So he was thinking that since Jackson was up for re-election, he would try to avoid controversy and avoid attacking something as powerful as the bank to protect his candidacy. But people like Biddle, they underestimate something called character. See, to somebody like Jackson, at least from my estimation, he's president not for being president. He's president because of what he wants to accomplish. So after Bill puts in this request, Congress actually approves this and passes legislation to expand the bank charter for another 20-year period. But Andrew Jackson vetoes the bill. So then everyone starts attacking Jackson. They're raising concerns about his veto not being constitutional and talking about how this is a economic threat or a social threat, could cause civil unrest. You're messing with the nation's money supply, blah, 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 blah. In Jackson's veto message, he focused on 3 key points. One being the injustice of giving the bank a government-sponsored monopoly. 2, the bank's unconstitutionality. And 3, the danger of foreign control over the bank. Jackson further emphasized that it was particularly unjust when these profits went not only to the wealthy, but also to foreign investors who are reaping the benefits at the expense of the American citizens. So all this wealth, this inflation that was being extracted from ordinary American citizens, was either being sent overseas to foreign investors or given to the top 1% of people in America who were selling out their citizens. So Jackson was faced with staunch opposition to this, and it turns out that the Supreme Court actually ruled in 1819 that it was constitutional to have a central bank mechanism in the United States, but Jackson, being a badass, argued that he was not bound by the Supreme Court's prior ruling on the bank's constitutionality, saying that as both President and Congress had the right to interpret the Constitution themselves. He pointed out that the Founding Fathers deliberately divided power among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches to create a system of checks and balances. This division was intended to prevent any one branch from having too much power, not to ensure efficiency. Jackson emphasized that each government official by oath is morally obligated to uphold the Constitution based on their own judgment, making independent constitutional interpretation essential. So Jackson's putting his political career on the line in an election year, vetoing a bill passed by Congress and going against the Supreme Court. But don't forget, the bank president, Nick Biddle, had Congress in his pocket, and he followed the Rothschild playbook by making sure to reward compliant politicians, and they were not willing to bite the hand that fed them. So they were fighting on Bill's behalf. Biddle had an army of legislators and people in media fighting tooth and nail to save the bank. There was a quote by Senator Daniel Webster saying, quote, "I believe my retainer has not been renewed or refreshed as usual. If it be wished that my relation to the bank should be continued, it may be well to send me the usual retainers." And this extended all throughout Congress and the members of the press. Republican Congressman John Randolph was quoted saying, quote, "Every man you meet in this house or out of it is either a stockholder, president, cashier, clerk, doorkeeper, runner, engraver, papermaker, or mechanic in some way or another to a bank." Yeah, when you have the power to print money, you could bribe a lot of people. But you know what Jackson did? Exactly what a president should do. He spoke directly to the people. He went on a nationwide tour, delivering powerful speeches aimed at leaving an impactful impression upon the people about the detrimental effect of the bank, and called the bank a hydra-headed monster devouring the common man, and vowed to either defeat the bank or be defeated by it. He was such a savage that he would go around saying to people, "You have two options, bank and no Jackson, or no bank and Jackson. That's it." And he made it a point to pay all of his campaign expenses in gold. He's like, "This is rag money. Paper money is rag money." So he's trying to encourage people to use gold as the popular use of exchange, which it wasn't. It wasn't even at that time. He kept calling paper money rag money. So Jackson tapped into the anger of the people because, I mean, they're not stupid. They know that their wealth has been extracted over the last decade. So he ends up absolutely demolishing this election. He gets 55% of the popular vote and 80% of the electoral college. So gets past that, but bank war is far from over. So he's able to crush it in the election against all odds, against the media, against Congress, against the Supreme Court, but bank war still has 4 more years to go. So Jackson wastes zero time. Day one after the election, Jackson says, quote, "Hydra of corruption is only scotched, not dead." And immediately after the election, Jackson proceeds to order the Secretary of the Treasury, William Duane, to place all new deposits of the federal government into various state banks around the country and to pay current expenses out of the funds still held by the Bank of the United States until the account was drained to zero. Jackson anticipated that without the use of federal money, the bank would cease to exist. But surprisingly, but get this, so Secretary of the Treasury, the Janet Yellen of the time, this guy, he rejects Jackson's order to drain the funds of the central bank. He says that to do so would be disruptive to the economy. So the bank got to this guy too, I guess. And it was a weird situation because it wasn't the first time that a president and a cabinet officer disagreed, but in the past, these types of things were typically resolved by the resignation of the person who disagreed with the president. But this guy, the Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, he refused to resign, raising a constitutional concern, saying that while the president did constitutionally need Senate approval to appoint an official, the Constitution was not specific on whether or not the Senate approval was needed for dismissals or firings, implying that it might be necessary to get Senate approval to fire him. So picture this guy raises this concern, and then everybody's like, "Oh, yeah, there's a concern. Like, we have to interpret that." But Jackson was a man of action. He had no patience for such theoretical interpretations. So later that day, a letter promptly arrived on the Treasury Secretary's desk and said, quote, "Your further services as Secretary of the Treasury are no longer required." So chop, chop, goodbye. Peace. So the next day, Jackson began draining the deposits of the central bank. Jackson was feeling victory vibes. He says, quote, "I have it chained. I'm ready with the screws to draw every tooth and then the stumps. If I'm not mistaken, we will have Mr. Biddle in his bank as quiet and as harmless as a lamb in just 6 weeks," end quote. So Biddle's response to this This quote, "This worthy president thinks that because he has scalped Indians and imprisoned judges, he is to have his way with the bank? Well, he's mistaken." End quote. Ready? So here's Biddle's game plan. So this is an example of a guy who's totally fine with just burning down the world to get his way. He says, quote, "Nothing but widespread suffering will produce any effect in Congress. Our only safety is in pursuing a steady course of firm restriction, and I have no doubt that such a course will ultimately lead to the restoration of the currency and the recharter of the bank." So Biddle's essentially saying, all right, if we jack rates up and stop lending money, start calling in loans, reduce the money supply, we're going to put immense economic pain on the average citizen, put businesses out of business, and everybody's going to get mad at Congress. And then Congress isn't going to have the backbone to uphold what Jackson's doing. So Biddle uses the American people as pawns in his fight to save the bank, and he triggered crazy economic chaos. The suddenly contracts the money supply. And this is at a time where businesses had become reliant and sort of accustomed to easy lending and easy monetary policy. And so this was at the same time that tariffs were due, and it really increased the demand for cash. So it resulted in economic disruption like job cuts, bankruptcies, falling wages. So by December of that year, Congress gets together, has a panic session, the nation's in complete turmoil, newspapers and angry letters blaming Jackson for the crisis, the whole 9 yards. In the optics of this, it looked like Bill's plan was working because, everybody was criticizing Jackson, saying that he was the reason for this economic pain because he decided to remove federal deposits and opposed Congress. So what does Congress do? For the first and only time in American history, Congress passed a resolution of a censure against the president. CENSURE. Not like censor, not to block the viewing of something, but a censure is a public disapproval of the president from Congress. So they passed this against Jackson. It's the first and only time it's ever happened to a president. Even Trump didn't get this. And it deeply hurt Jackson, but it really didn't represent how the people were feeling. It passed by a very narrow margin. So this went on for months and months and months. It's these congressional sessions of senators criticizing Jackson, saying it's all his fault. Newspapers, senators, congresspeople, judges, former presidents, bankers, all pounding Jackson, saying this is all his fault. This is all his fault. The economy's in turmoil because of Jackson. But Jackson kept speaking directly to the people and highlighting the fact that arrogant Biddle was actually boasting about a strategy to disrupt the economy and make people think that it was Jackson's fault. So Jackson's on a national campaign telling people that Biddle's the one doing this, that he's bragging about it. And Governor Wolf of Pennsylvania actually had a massive impact on this because Pennsylvania was the home state of the bank, and the governor publicly denounced both Biddle and the central bank, saying that it was Biddle's fault that this was happening, and that the central bank was a demonic force amongst America, and that was extracting the wealth from the average person. So, politicians, they float in whichever direction the wind's blowing, and once public sentiment flipped in favor of Jackson, House quickly went along with them, and they passed a bunch of resolutions affirming Jackson's beliefs and policies. Resolution 1, the House declared that the Bank of the United States ought not be rechartered. Resolution 2, the House agreed that federal deposits ought not be restored to the bank. Resolution 3, House called for the establishment of a special committee to investigate whether the bank had deliberately caused an economic crisis or not. And thankfully, the Senate had the decency to rescind the public censure of Andrew Jackson a few years later. Worth mentioning, one of the resolutions passed by Congress was an investigation into Biddle, but Biddle defied Congress. So this is an example of the type of power that a central banker has over the people who make the laws. So Biddle ignores the subpoena, and when an investigating committee arrived at the bank's doors in Philadelphia with a subpoena to examine the books, Nicholas Biddle refused to comply. He also denied access to correspondence with congressmen about personal loans and advances and refused to testify before the committee in Washington. So normally, this type of behavior would lead to contempt citations, fines, imprisonment, but Biddle escaped punishment. Why? You know it, because many of the people in Congress opposed extreme actions and prevented a citation or contempt. Why, you might ask? Well, Biddle can't help but brag about it. Biddle was quoted as saying, it'd be pretty ironic if I ended up getting imprisoned by the votes of members of Congress because I would not give up to their enemies their confidential letters. So Biddle gets off the hook because a lot of the people in Congress were just as guilty as he was, but in the court of public opinion, his reputation was ruined. And within just a few years, the national debt from the War of 1812 is paid off, and there's a surplus of $35 million, which Andrew Jackson orders the Treasury to return to the states to fund public works. Now, this sounds like a beautiful thing to people like me and you, but it's horrifying fine to the central bankers and the people like the Rothschilds. So on January 30th, 1835, an assassination attempt was made on Andrew Jackson's life by Richard Lawrence. Now, miraculously, by the grace of God, both of Lawrence's pistols misfired and Jackson survived. Lawrence later declared that he was insane, and he claimed to have connections with powerful people in Europe who had promised to protect him from punishment. Oh man, who do you think that could be? I don't know. I don't want to speculate. And legend has it that when this gun was inspected, it worked perfectly fine. So investigators, they apprehend this guy, they grab the gun, like, wow, this thing misfired twice, and they go to like shoot it, see if it's broken. Boom, boom, works perfectly fine. So that is divine intervention, similar to what happened with Trump. And I mean, I'll tell you what, anytime that God intervenes on an assassination attempt, I take that as that person's doing the right thing. Well, actually, no, some bad people have survived assassination attempts. Interesting. Well, anyway, the bank charter expires in 1836, and it was restructured as a state bank under the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Biddle was later arrested and charged with fraud, but didn't end up being convicted, but he was still undergoing litigation when he died. And as a result of this, the global bankers realized that the people of the United States just didn't want a central bank and said, okay, you know what? We're just going to leave them alone, let them do their thing and not destroy their wealth and their savings and their way of life. And the United States lived happily ever after without ever having a central bank again and never went back into extreme national debt or any type of inflationary spirals. Jokes. Next, the Rothschilds caused the Civil War. All right, so let me give you a little tease for what's happening in the next episode. So we enter the Civil War, and let's just say that everything you know about the Civil War is a lie, and the Rothschilds were very much involved in causing the Civil War and causing a certain leader of the United States to die. Yeah, it's crazy. Apologies for how long this episode took to come out. We've had a crazy last month here with the election and everything, but it's on me. I'm going to do better with this one, getting this one out faster. Love you. Thanks for being patient. As always, thank you so much for watching, guys. If you enjoy what I'm doing here, join the Forbidden Book Society on Patreon. That is where we really dive deep beneath the surface with this, because we're only really hitting surface level here on YouTube, but in this Forbidden Book Society network that's turning into much more than just a book club. Started off as just a book club, but now we're giving a daily newsletter for stuff that you might not find on mainstream media. Some of it you might find on it, but just a nice, organized, concise PDF every day to give you a rundown of what's happening in the world. But I want to build a intelligence community. Join the Forbidden Book Society on Patreon. Link below. Can't wait to see you there.